And I gotta say, you've got some really deep Ohio roots.
Last week, with help from Ancestry.com, we showed you just how deep my Ohio roots were on my mother Elizabeth's side. Her father's grandfather, John Matthews, drove an ambulance in the Civil War and fathered 16 children with wife Lydia to help with their farm in Gallia County. My mother's grandfather, David Keeler, in Darke County, was first cousin of Phoebe Ann Moses, better known as Annie Oakley. But Michelle thought my mother's mother, Elsie Keeler, was most compelling. Growing up in Darke County as one of 6 children of a migrant farmer, she got her nursing degree in Dayton, moved to Columbus in 1929, her first job at the Ohio Pen. She met and married Marshall Matthews, a postal carrier, in 1931. For 2 years, they lived a beautiful life, including the birth of my mother, Elizabeth. But in July 1933, just days after this picture is taken, my grandfather's admitted to White Cross Hospital with encephalitis lethargica. In a coma by the end of July, the stress may have sent my grandmother into labor 7 weeks early, delivering twins on July 30th, 1933. 1 day later, her newborn daughter, Norma Jean, died. The next day, so did her husband, Marshall. Elsie unable to witness their burial because of serious complications.
She wasn't able to say goodbye.
Through death certificate records, Michelle and I returned to a place of happiness and great sadness.
681 Malvern is where the family lived. This is the residence that was listed on both Norma and Marshall's death certificates.
I sat on the front stairs and thought about my mother, who sat there alone without her dad. On this sunny day, a leaking drain brought a somber reminder.
But also a house of plenty of tears.
But it also was the place of resolve for Elsie Keeler. By the time this picture was taken in 1934, Elsie was working as a nurse at White Cross Hospital and as a private duty nurse at night, using her younger sister, Alice, known as Sally, as babysitter. Ancestry.com found this 1940 census listing Elsie, my mother, and Uncle Marshall. And by then, Grandma was also working as a hotel laundress.
That's a survivor. There's a fighting spirit.
Later that year, she remarried a gas station owner named Arthur Marsh. They had a child, my Aunt Leslie, in 1942. But the years after that were hell for Elsie, Marshall, and my mother, including extreme physical abuse of my grandmother and my Uncle Marshall. But my mother endured an even worse abuse, keeping her silence under threats hard to imagine. My mother graduated early from East High School to get away and went to Otterbein, shortly after breaking down and confessing to my Aunt Sally the abuse that she had suffered in silence for years. My aunt and uncle immediately told Elsie. Art was kicked out of the house and quickly divorced. Uncle Marshall enlisted in the Air Force at 17. Elsie, broken-hearted, devastated, and alone again, moved to this little house on Mossman in Westerville with her youngest daughter, Leslie, working long hours at North American Aviation, a tiny house I remember well.
The only way you could get upstairs is to pull down the staircase, but she would always want the kids to come over, the grandkids. We would spend Friday nights watching movies, having our own TV dinner, and eating Orange Circus peanuts.
But life was hardly a circus for Elsie, as she dealt with son Marshall's emotional issues related to the abuse he had taken from his stepfather. After her youngest left for college, she was alone, but that faded as she became more involved at church and elsewhere. She became her grandkids' biggest fan, here with me at the high school graduation. When rheumatoid arthritis gnarled her hands in the late 60s and early 70s, she began carving and painting. Though painful, she persevered to create pieces of beauty. And she lived in peace with her youngest daughter and husband for her last 5 years until her death in 1977. Now, 36 years later, I return to Sunset Cemetery near Galloway, and there I make a stunning discovery.
You know, we actually spoke with the caretaker of the cemetery, and Marshall and Norma were buried together. They're in the same grave.
Father and one-day-old daughter, Norma Jean, resting together. And next to them, the woman they left behind to be such a blessing and inspiration to the generations to follow.